Hello everyone, I'm Creepy Raindrops, and I'm here to assist you today. I know many of you use this video to unwind and fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Get cozy, relax, and let yourself drift into calm. The Lost Trail of Ravenwood. It was late October when a group of 4 friends, Emily, Mike, Sarah, and Jake, decided to go camping in the sprawling Ravenwood Forest, located in northern Vermont. The air was crisp, and the trees had mostly shed their autumn leaves, leaving the forest floor carpeted in hues of amber and brown. The plan was simple: hike to the heart of Ravenwood, set up camp near the old Ranger's Lookout Tower, and enjoy a weekend away from their busy lives. They arrived at the forest entrance just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, its orange glow bleeding through the skeletal branches. Mike, the most adventurous of the group, held the map, tracing the trail with his finger. "The lookout tower is about 4 miles in," he said confidently, though the others couldn't help but notice the faint tremor in his voice. "Are we sure about this?" Sarah asked, hugging her jacket tightly around her. "I read something about this forest. People have gone missing here." Jake chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, Sarah, those are just campfire stories. Probably written to scare people like you." Emily chimed in, her voice steady. "Let's stick to the trail and keep our phones charged. We'll be fine." They set off into the woods, flashlights slicing through the growing darkness. The first hour passed uneventfully, filled with the sound of crunching leaves and casual conversation. But as they ventured deeper, an uneasy silence began to settle over the group. The forest grew denser, the trees seeming to crowd in around them. A low mist began to snake through the undergrowth, clinging to their boots and making the path harder to discern. Mike stopped suddenly. "Wait, this doesn't look right." Emily leaned over his shoulder, peering at the map. "Did we miss a turn?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "No," Mike insisted, though doubt clouded his expression. "The map says we should be near the old stream by now. But there's nothing here." Sarah looked around nervously. "What do you mean, nothing? We've been walking for hours. The stream should be nearby, right?" Jake shined his flashlight ahead, but the beam only revealed more gnarled trees and thick fog. "Let's just keep moving. We'll find it." But as they pressed on, the air seemed to grow heavier, the forest eerily quiet. Even the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the hoot of an owl was absent. Then they saw it. A crude wooden sign nailed to a tree, its faded letters barely legible in the dim light. "Turn back," Sarah read aloud, her voice trembling. "What the hell does that mean?" Mike tried to shrug it off. "It's probably some old prank. Or a warning," Emily said, glancing over her shoulder. Jake, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "We're not turning back now. The tower's got to be close." Reluctantly, they continued, but the atmosphere grew more oppressive with every step. The trees seemed almost alive, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Sarah stumbled over a root, her flashlight clattering to the ground and momentarily going out. "Careful," Emily said, helping her up. When Sarah picked up her flashlight and switched it back on, the beam landed on something that made her blood run cold. A single muddy boot lying in the middle of the path. "Guys," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" Jake asked, stepping closer. She pointed to the boot and they all froze. It was small, too small to belong to any of them. Beside it, half buried in the mud, was a rusted pocket knife. Mike crouched down, his hand hovering over the knife. This looks old," he murmured, brushing away some of the dirt. "Leave it," Emily said sharply. "We don't know whose it is or why it's here." As they stood there, trying to make sense of the discovery, A sound broke the silence. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoing through the forest. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct. Tap, tap, tap. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering. Jake spun around, aiming his flashlight into the fog. "Probably just a woodpecker," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. But deep down, none of them believed him. The tapping grew louder, steady, and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was making the sound wanted to be heard. It echoed unnaturally through the trees, bouncing off the thick fog that now wrapped itself around them like a suffocating blanket. Emily gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, her breath visible in the cold air. "We need to get moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Mike said, standing still. "We need to figure out where this is coming from. What if it's someone who needs help? Or someone who wants to hurt us?" Sarah shot back, her eyes darting nervously around the trees. Jake stepped forward, gripping a heavy stick he'd picked up along the trail. "I'll check it out," he said, his bravado masking his fear. "Are you insane?" Emily hissed, grabbing his arm. "We're sticking together." The tapping stopped. All four of them froze, their ears straining against the silence. The absence of the sound was even more unnerving than its presence. Suddenly, a shrill, bone-chilling scream pierced the air. It was distant but unmistakably human. The group turned toward the sound, their flashlights jerking wildly as they tried to pinpoint its origin. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We all heard it," Mike said, his voice shaky. Emily swallowed hard. "It sounded like it came from ahead, near where we're going." "Then we're going back," Sarah said firmly, already turning around. Jake grabbed her arm. "We can't. We don't even know if we're on the right trail anymore. Turning back could get us even more lost." Emily pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she checked the GPS. The screen loaded slowly, the spinning icon mocking her. "There's no signal," she said, her voice hollow. "Of course, there isn't," Mike muttered under his breath. Another sound broke the tension, a faint rustling in the bushes just off the path. All four flashlights snapped toward it, illuminating nothing but tangled branches. "An animal," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. Emily stepped closer to Sarah, gripping her hand. "We need to keep going. The tower can't be much farther." Reluctantly, the group pressed on, their steps hurried and uneven. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees looming impossibly tall. The mist thickened, curling around their ankles and swallowing the light from their flashlights. Then they saw it, a faint orange glow through the fog. "Is that the tower?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with hope. Jake squinted. "It's a fire." As they approached, the outline of a small clearing came into view. In the center of the clearing was a dying campfire, its embers crackling softly. Around it lay scattered belongings: a torn backpack, a pair of hiking boots, a faded plaid jacket. But no people. "Someone was just here," Emily said, her voice hushed. "Yet," Jake added, scanning the area. "But where are they now?" Sarah stepped closer to the fire, staring at the jacket. This looks old," she murmured, reaching down to pick it up. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes widening as she saw a name stitched into the inside collar. T. Harper. Emily frowned. "That name sounds familiar." Mike's face went pale. "Thomas Harper. He's one of the people who went missing here. About 10 years ago." Sarah dropped the jacket as if it had burned her. "We shouldn't be here," she said, backing away. Before anyone could respond, the tapping sound returned. The movement was subtle at first, a shifting of the shadows just outside the reach of their flashlight beams. Emily's breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted to the source. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake replied, tightening his grip on the stick in his hand. "Something's out there." The tapping grew louder again, each sound now accompanied by an eerie creaking, like wood bending under pressure. It came from all around them, as though the forest itself was alive and encircling them. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, his voice breaking as he spun in a circle, aiming his flashlight wildly into the fog. The light caught something, a fleeting glimpse of a pale face, half hidden behind a tree. "Over there!" Jake yelled, pointing toward the figure. But when they turned their flashlights in that direction, there was nothing. Just the gnarled bark of the trees and the thick mist swirling between them. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice cracking as she grabbed Emily's arm. "Now?" Emily nodded, but as she turned, she noticed something strange. The trail they had just come down was gone. The forest floor looked undisturbed, as though no one had walked there in years. "Where's the path?" she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "It was right here," Mike said, panic rising in his voice. He took a step back, his flashlight beam trembling in his unsteady hand. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl. The sound seemed to vibrate through the air, coming from somewhere deep within the fog. Emily's skin prickled as she turned toward the sound, her flashlight shaking in her grip. What was that?" Sarah stammered, clutching Emily's arm so tightly it hurt. Jake took a step forward, his stick raised defensively. "Whatever it is, it's close." The growl came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to circle them. "Stay together," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. But before they could decide what to do, the footsteps stopped. A chilling silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the faint crackle of the dying fire. Then, from behind them, a voice, soft and childlike. "Help me!" The group whipped around, their flashlights converging on a single spot. Standing there, just a few feet away, was a little girl. Her clothes were tattered, her hair matted with dirt. She looked no older than 10, her wide eyes reflecting the light like a deer caught in headlights. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "Don't leave me here." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God. She's real." Emily stepped forward cautiously. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the darkness beyond the clearing. "They're over there," she whispered. Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "We didn't see anyone." But the girl interrupted him, her voice suddenly louder, more urgent. "They're waiting for you." Emily froze. "Waiting for us? What do you mean?" The little girl tilted her head, her expression blank. "You shouldn't have come here." Before anyone could react, the fire suddenly flared to life, its flames roaring unnaturally high. The intense heat forced them to stagger back, shielding their faces. When the fire died down just as quickly as it had flared, the girl was gone. "Where did she go?" Sarah cried, spinning around, her flashlight searching the clearing. "She couldn't have just disappeared," Mike said, his voice shaking. "She was right here." But the forest was silent again. The tapping, the growling, even the footsteps, all gone. Jake glanced at the items scattered near the fire. The old boots, the torn backpack, the jacket with the name T. Harper, and his face turned pale. "I don't think we're alone out here," he muttered. Emily grabbed his arm. "We were never alone." The screams sliced through the dense forest air, reverberating in their chests like a warning bell. It was unmistakably human, raw and desperate, yet it sounded wrong, stretched and warped, as if filtered through something unnatural. "That's it," Sarah cried, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "We're going back. I don't care if we're lost. I'm not staying here another second." "Wait!" Emily grabbed Sarah's wrist, her voice sharp but trembling. "If we just run, we'll get more lost. We need to stay together." "Stay together? For what?" Sarah shouted, yanking her hand free. "So we can die together?" "Shoo!" Mike hissed, holding up a hand. His wide eyes scanned the woods. "Do you hear that?" At first, there was nothing but the crackling remnants of the fire and Sarah's labored breathing. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, echoed through the trees. They weren't heavy like before, but light and deliberate, as if someone or something was circling them. "Who's out there?" Jake bellowed into the darkness, swinging his stick wildly. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the forest was eerily still. Then came the whispering. It started as a low hum, barely audible, but it grew steadily louder, surrounding them on all sides. The voices overlapped, speaking in hushed, unintelligible tones, rising and falling like a sinister chant. Emily shone her flashlight into the fog, her pulse racing. "What are they saying?" "I don't know," Mike whispered, backing closer to the group. "But it's not English. It's not human," Sarah added, her voice trembling. And then they saw it. Figures began to emerge from the fog, their shapes distorted and flickering as if they weren't fully solid. They were tall, unnaturally thin, their faces obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to them like a second skin. Their movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as they slowly closed in on the clearing. "Run," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Jake said, gripping his stick tightly. "We stand our ground. Run," Emily shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the remnants of the trail. The group bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they tore through the forest. The whispering followed them, growing louder and more frantic, as if the figures were giving chase. Mike tripped on an exposed root and went sprawling to the ground. "Mike!" Emily screamed, doubling back to help him. Jake skidded to a stop and swung his flashlight around, but the fog was too thick. "I don't see them," he yelled. "Just go," Mike shouted, scrambling to his feet. His voice was frantic. "Don't wait for me. We're not leaving you," Emily yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. The group ran blindly, the forest around them twisting and changing. The trees seemed closer together now, their branches clawing at their clothes and hair. The fog thickened, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, without warning, they burst into another clearing. But this one wasn't empty. In the center stood a small, weathered cabin, its roof sagging and its windows dark. The wooden door was slightly ajar, swinging lazily on its hinges. "What the hell is that doing out here?" Jake asked, panting as he bent over to catch his breath. "I don't know," Emily said, her voice shaky, "but it's shelter. Maybe we can—" "Are you insane?" Sarah interrupted. "We're not going in there. Do you want to stay out here with them?" Jake snapped, pointing back toward the trees. The whispering was still there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, growing louder with every passing second. Emily made the decision for them. Inside. Now. They hesitated for only a moment before following her, the door creaking ominously as they pushed it open. The interior of the cabin was just as unsettling as the outside. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. A single, broken chair lay in the corner, and the remains of a rotting table sat in the center of the room. But what caught their attention was the wall. Carved into the wood, in uneven, jagged letters, was a single word repeated over and over. Stay. What does it mean? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The slam of the door echoed through the small cabin, the sound vibrating in their chests like a warning bell. Sarah screamed, clutching Emily's arm so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Jake spun around, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. "Who closed the door?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "It wasn't the wind," Mike muttered, stepping closer to Emily. His eyes darted nervously toward the walls, the word "stay" carved into the wood seeming to pulse in the dim light. The whispering outside the cabin had stopped. Now there was only silence, a thick, suffocating stillness that pressed against their ears. "I don't like this," Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "We need to get out of here." Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "We can't go back out there. Whatever's out there, it's waiting for us, but we can't just stay here." Jake snapped, pacing the room. "What if—" A sudden, rhythmic knocking interrupted him, loud and deliberate, coming from the door they had just entered. "Knock! Knock! Knock!" The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Who is it?" Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. "Don't answer it," Emily said quickly, her eyes locked on the door. Jake stepped forward, gripping the stick he still held like a weapon. "If they wanted to get in, they already would have," he reasoned, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Knock! Knock! Knock! Jake, stop!" Emily hissed as he reached for the doorknob. But before he could touch it, the knocking stopped. They waited, the silence heavier than ever, each second stretching out into an eternity. Then, from the other side of the door, a familiar voice called out. "Help me," Sarah gasped. "That's the little girl." "No, it's not," Emily said firmly, stepping between Sarah and the door. "You don't know that," Sarah cried, trying to push past her. "Yes, I do," Emily snapped. "It's a trap. Don't you get it? Nothing out here is what it seems." The voice came again, softer this time but more desperate. "Please, I'm scared. Let me in." Jake hesitated, his hand hovering near the doorknob. "What if she's real?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. Emily shook her head. She disappeared into thin air. "Jake, does that sound real to you?" The voice outside shifted, growing deeper, more guttural. "Let me in," it growled, the words distorted and inhuman. Jake stumbled back, dropping the stick in his hand. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could respond, the single window on the far wall shattered, the shards of glass scattering across the floor. A cold wind rushed into the cabin, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Sarah screamed, and Emily reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "Stay together," she shouted over the sound of the howling wind. The whispering returned, louder and closer than ever, as if it was inside the cabin now. Shadows flickered across the walls, shapes that didn't belong to any of them, moving too fast to track. Suddenly, the air grew still again, and the cabin fell silent. "Is everyone okay?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I'm here," Jake said, his voice somewhere to her left. "Me too," Mike added from behind her. "Sarah?" Emily asked, her grip tightening on the hand she was holding. But there was no response. "Sarah?" Emily called again, her voice rising in panic. The hand she was holding tightened its grip, but when Emily turned to look, Her stomach dropped. It wasn't Sarah standing next to her. It was the little girl. Her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto Emily's, and her lips curled into a chilling smile. "You should have stayed," the girl whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. The cabin's walls groaned, the word "stay" seeming to etch itself deeper into the wood, glowing faintly in the darkness. And then the floor beneath them began to crack. The cracks in the floor spread rapidly, jagged fissures tearing through the rotting wood. Emily stumbled backward, yanking her hand free from the girl's icy grip. The little girl didn't move. She simply stood there, smiling, as the floorboards began to buckle beneath her. "Emily, what's happening?" Mike shouted, his flashlight flickering back to life just in time to illuminate the widening cracks. "I don't know," Emily cried, scrambling to her feet. "But we need to get out of here. Now." Jake grabbed Sarah, who was crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth. "Come on, we've got to move," he yelled, pulling her to her feet. The glowing word "stay" on the walls pulsed brighter, casting an eerie light across the room. The cabin groaned as if it were alive, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through the floor. Then, with a deafening crack, the center of the floor gave way entirely, revealing a gaping black void beneath. Emily froze, staring into the darkness. It wasn't just an empty space. It felt alive, a swirling abyss that seemed to pull at her very soul. The whispering grew louder, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of anger and despair. "Don't look," Jake shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. But it was too late. Emily's legs buckled as a wave of nausea washed over her, the pull of the void almost impossible to resist. She felt as though something was reaching for her, invisible hands clawing at her mind. The little girl stepped closer to the edge of the abyss, her bare feet teetering on the broken floorboards. Her smile widened, unnaturally so, splitting her face in a way that was anything but human. "You can't leave," she said, her voice distorted, echoing with 100 other voices. "This place is yours now. Like hell it is." Jake roared, hurling his stick at her. The stick passed through her as though she were made of smoke, clattering uselessly into the void below. The girl tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "No one leaves." The cabin shook violently, the remaining floorboards splintering as the cracks raced toward the walls. Mike grabbed Sarah, who was sobbing uncontrollably, and dragged her toward the door. "We're getting out of here," he shouted. Emily and Jake followed, the four of them stumbling toward the door as the room collapsed around them. The door resisted when Jake tried to yank it open, but with a final, desperate pull, it flew open, and they spilled out into the forest. But the forest had changed. The fog was thicker than before, swirling around them like a living thing. The trees were closer, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The whispering followed them, louder and more insistent, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. "We can't stop," Emily yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her forward. "Keep moving." They ran blindly, their flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive mist. The ground beneath their feet felt wrong, spongy and cold, as though they were running on something not entirely solid. And then the whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Where do we go?" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with panic. "There," Mike pointed, his flashlight illuminating a faint trail ahead. They bolted for it, their breaths ragged, their legs burning with the effort. The laughter faded as they ran, replaced by the distant sound of the river, the same river they had crossed hours earlier. "That's it," Emily shouted. If we can get to the river, we can follow it out of here. But as they neared the sound of rushing water, the ground beneath them shifted. Emily stumbled and fell, landing hard on her knees. When she looked up, her stomach dropped. The river was there, but it wasn't water flowing through it. It was black, swirling, like the void beneath the cabin. The whispers were louder now, rising from the river itself. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the roar. Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know, but it's not the way out." From behind them, the laughter returned, closer this time. And then, stepping out of the fog, came the figures. Tall and shadowy, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded the group, their glowing eyes locked onto them. "There's no escape," one of them said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. Emily grabbed Jake's hand, her voice trembling. "We have to jump into that," Jake shouted, pointing at the black river. "Do you have a better idea?" Emily shot back, tears streaming down her face. The figures stepped closer, their shadows stretching impossibly long. The whispers grew deafening, the voices overlapping in a chaotic, maddening cacophony. Emily looked at the others, her heart pounding. "It's this or we stay here forever." She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and jumped. The air seemed to thin as Emily plunged into the black void of the river. The rushing sound of the whispers gave way to an oppressive silence, as though the world itself had stopped. She felt weightless, suspended in darkness that pressed against her skin like ice. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was falling, floating, or sinking. Panic clawed at her chest, and she opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Around her, faint shapes flickered in the darkness. Faces, distorted and anguished, their mouths opening and closing silently as if crying for help. Then, all at once, she was yanked downward. The sensation was violent, like being dragged by an unseen current. The darkness around her began to twist, forming shapes. Trees, rocks, the outlines of the forest. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder, more frantic. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Gasping, she scrambled to her feet, her flashlight miraculously still clutched in her hand. The beam flickered weakly, illuminating her surroundings. She was in the forest again, but it was different. The fog was gone, replaced by a strange, dim light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The trees were taller, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes that seemed to reach for her. The ground was covered in a fine, silvery ash that clung to her shoes. "Jake? Mike? Sarah?" she called, her voice echoing strangely in the still air. A rustling sound came from behind her, and she spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Emily!" It was Jake. He stumbled out of the shadows, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "Are you okay? Where are the others?" "I don't know," she said, running to him. "I thought they jumped right after me." They both turned at the sound of more rustling. Moments later, Mike emerged, dragging Sarah, who looked dazed and unsteady on her feet. "Is everyone here?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse. Emily nodded, though relief was fleeting. "What is this place?" she whispered, looking around. Jake shook his head. "It's not the forest. At least, not the same one we were in." The air was heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. The faint hum of the whispers lingered at the edge of hearing, like a warning they couldn't decipher. "We have to keep moving," Emily said, gripping her flashlight tighter. "Staying still isn't an option." They began walking, their footsteps muffled by the strange ash that blanketed the ground. The forest around them seemed to shift as they moved, the trees bending and twisting as though alive. Then they saw it, a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still between the trees. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake said, his voice low. "Don't look away. Keep your eyes on it." As they moved closer, the figure became clearer. It was the little girl. She stood facing them, her head tilted slightly to one side, her eyes glowing faintly in the eerie light. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice soft but resonating through the forest. Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. "We didn't mean to come here. We're trying to leave." The girl smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "There is no leaving," she said. "This place has always been here, waiting. And now it has you." "Like hell it does," Jake growled, stepping in front of Emily. "Tell us how to get out of here, or—" The girl's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold disdain. "You don't command them," she said, her voice deepening, the resonance unnatural. Suddenly, the forest erupted with movement. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their glowing eyes locking onto the group. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made it impossible to think. "Run!" Emily screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand. They bolted, weaving through the twisted trees as the figures gave chase. The shadows moved unnaturally fast, their bodies flickering in and out of sight as though they were phasing through the forest itself. The group burst into another clearing, their chests heaving with exhaustion. In the center stood a massive tree, its roots twisting into the ground like claws. Carved into the bark, glowing faintly, was a single word: leave. "What does it mean?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. Emily stared at the tree, her mind racing. "Maybe it's a way out," she said. "But how?" Sarah cried. Before anyone could answer, the shadows closed in, circling the clearing. The figures stopped just at the edge of the light, their eyes burning with malice. Emily looked back at the tree. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. "I think we have to touch it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Are you insane?" Jake snapped. "What if it's another trap? Do you have a better idea?" Emily shot back. The shadows began to move closer, their forms distorting, their whispers turning into guttural growls. Emily took a deep breath, reached out her hand, and touched the tree. The moment Emily's hand touched the tree, an intense surge of energy shot through her body. It wasn't painful, it was overwhelming, like being hit by a wave of freezing water and blinding heat at the same time. Her vision blurred as the clearing around her dissolved into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. "Emily!" Jake shouted, his voice sounding distant and distorted. She couldn't respond. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. But they weren't coming from the shadows anymore. They were coming from the tree itself, voices overlapping in a desperate, pleading cacophony. "Set us free. Let us go, help us." The bark beneath her hand began to writhe, as though the tree was alive. Faces formed in the bark, twisted, anguished faces that seemed to scream silently, their mouths gaping wide. Emily tried to pull her hand away, but she couldn't. The tree held her in place, its energy coursing through her like a live wire. She felt as though she were being torn in two, her consciousness splitting between the clearing and somewhere else. Somewhere dark, cold, and endless. "Emily, let go!" Jake yelled, grabbing her shoulders and trying to pull her back. But the moment his hands touched her, the same force pulled him in. His eyes widened as he gasped, his body going rigid. "What is this?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The shadows circling the clearing stopped moving, their glowing eyes fixed on Emily and Jake. their bodies trembling as though they were afraid. "Emily!" Mike screamed, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back. "What's happening to them?" Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. I don't know." Emily's mind was flooded with images. The forest, once lush and beautiful, now twisted and dark. People, campers, hunters, wanderers, drawn into its depths, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair. The shadows weren't just spirits. They were remnants of those who had come before, their humanity stripped away by the forest's malevolent force. The tree's whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Destroy it, end it, free us." "How?" Emily gasped, her voice breaking. "How do I end it?" The faces in the tree bark twisted into anguished expressions. One of them mouthed a single word: "Fire." Emily's heart raced. Fire. It was the only way. But how could they ignite something so massive with the shadows closing in around them? Jake, still holding onto her shoulder, seemed to sense her thoughts. "The matches," he said hoarsely. "In my pack. They're still in my pack." Emily nodded, focusing all her strength on breaking free from the tree's grip. Slowly, painfully, she managed to pull her hand away. The moment she did, the energy released her, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Jake fell beside her, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We have to do it now," he panted, fumbling with his backpack. The shadows, sensing their intentions, began to close in again. Their growls turned into enraged howls, their forms shifting into grotesque, nightmarish shapes. Mike stepped forward, holding a heavy branch like a weapon. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "Just hurry." Jake's hands trembled as he pulled out the matches, passing them to Emily. "Do it," he said, his voice urgent. Emily struck the match, her hands shaking so badly it almost went out. The flame flickered to life, casting a small, golden glow against the darkness. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the tree. "Emily, now!" Jake shouted. She threw the match against the base of the tree. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a roar like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, the tree ignited. The fire spread quickly, consuming the twisted bark in bright, crackling flames. The faces in the tree bark screamed silently, their forms melting away as the fire burned higher and hotter. The shadows recoiled, their howls turning into shrieks of agony. One by one, they began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into the ash that coated the ground. The forest trembled violently, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The light from the burning tree grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding, forcing them to shield their eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the fire went out. When Emily opened her eyes, the forest was silent. The twisted trees were gone, replaced by ordinary pines and oaks. The ash on the ground had vanished, and the air was clear and fresh. "We're back," Sarah whispered, looking around in disbelief. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the forest. "It's over." Emily wasn't so sure. She turned back to where the tree had been, but there was no trace of it, just an empty patch of ground. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. "We need to get out of here before anything else happens." The group moved quickly, finding the trail and following it back to the parking lot where their car waited. As they piled in and drove away, none of them spoke, the events of the night weighing heavily on their minds. But as they turned onto the main road, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. Far in the distance, at the edge of the forest, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees. As the car sped down the dark, winding road, silence filled the cabin. The group sat in stunned exhaustion, their faces pale and drawn. Emily kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "I don't know," Emily admitted, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But we're not going back to find out." Jake shifted in his seat, wincing as he rubbed his temples. That tree, it felt like it was alive, like it was part of something bigger. "It wasn't just the tree," Mike said, his voice grim. "That whole forest, it was something else. Something wrong." Sarah shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "What if it's still out there? What if it finds us?" Emily didn't respond. She couldn't shake the image of the little girl standing at the edge of the forest. Her eerie smile etched into her memory. Hours passed as they drove, the forest fading into the distance. The sun began to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the horizon. The sight should have been comforting, but Emily felt no relief. "We need to stop," Jake said suddenly. "I need air." Emily nodded, pulling into a rest stop off the highway. It was deserted, the parking lot empty except for their car. The group stepped out, stretching their legs and breathing in the crisp morning air. Emily leaned against the car, staring out at the vast expanse of trees in the distance. They weren't the same trees from the forest, but they still made her uneasy. "We should talk to someone," Mike said, breaking the silence. "Tell the park rangers or someone who knows about these kinds of things." "Who's going to believe us?" Jake asked, his tone bitter. "That a haunted tree tried to kill us? That the forest came alive?" "They might," Sarah said hesitantly. "There's always stories about places like that. Maybe we're not the first ones." Emily turned to face them, her expression serious. "We're not talking to anyone," she said firmly. "What?" Sarah looked at her in shock. "If we tell people, they'll just think we're crazy," Emily continued. "And if we're not crazy, then we're putting other people in danger by making them curious." Jake nodded reluctantly. "She's right. The less anyone knows, the better." They all fell silent, the weight of their experience pressing down on them. "Let's just get home," Mike said finally. "We'll figure out what to do later." They climbed back into the car, and Emily started the engine. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, the rising sun casting long shadows across the pavement. As they drove, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every now and then, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the little girl or one of the shadowy figures. But there was nothing, just the endless road and the faint whisper of the wind. Weeks later, Emily sat alone in her apartment, staring at her computer screen. She had tried to move on, but the memories of that night haunted her. She couldn't sleep without dreaming of the forest, the tree, and the faces in the bark. Her curiosity had gotten the better of her. She had started researching the area where they had camped, digging through online forums, old news articles, and local legends. What she found chilled her to the bone. Stories of hikers disappearing without a trace. Reports of strange lights and sounds in the woods. Tales of a cursed forest that no one dared to enter. And one recurring detail in every account. A little girl, seen by those who came too close. Emily closed her laptop, her hands trembling. She thought about calling the others, but what could she say? That the forest might still be alive? That they might not be safe? As she sat there, the lights in her apartment flickered. A soft, familiar whisper filled the room. "Come back." Emily froze, her heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, surrounding her, filling her mind. And then she saw it. In the reflection of her darkened window, a figure stood behind her. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. The reflection in the window remained still, but she could feel the presence behind her, a suffocating weight that seemed to fill the room. She didn't dare turn around. The whispering grew louder, clearer, but not in any language she recognized. It was the same distorted, overlapping voices she had heard in the forest, but now it was close. So close she could almost feel it brushing against her skin. "Come back." The words sounded like a plea, but there was no comfort in the voice, no innocence, only a sense of desperate malice, like it had been waiting for this moment, for her to be vulnerable alone. Emily's pulse raced, her mind scrambling for some kind of explanation. It can't be real. Can't be real, asterisk. But the reflection in the window didn't lie. The little girl's glowing eyes locked with hers, her grin widening impossibly. The sight was enough to send a wave of nausea crashing through Emily. I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming, asterisk. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone, fumbling with the screen to call Jake or Mike, anyone. But the moment her finger grazed the screen, the lights flickered again, plunging her apartment into darkness. For a brief moment, she heard only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, a soft thud came from behind her. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly, painfully turned her head. The little girl was no longer in the reflection. She was standing in front of her, a few feet away, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the window. Her small, delicate hands were outstretched, reaching toward Emily with a slow, deliberate motion. "No," Emily gasped, stumbling back. "No, I won't." The little girl tilted her head, her grin stretching wider. "You can't leave, asterisk." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand. It was a statement of fact. Emily's mind raced, her hands trembling as she backed away. She had no idea what to do, no idea how to escape this nightmare. The fear was too much, too overwhelming. She glanced at the door, but the hallway beyond seemed to stretch impossibly long, the darkness closing in like a wall. The little girl took another step forward. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as if the very space around her was tightening, closing in. Suddenly, a loud crash from the living room shattered the silence. Emily whipped around, her heart in her throat. The front door. It had swung open, the handle rattling violently as if something or someone was trying to force it. The air shifted with an unsettling sound, like something heavy scraping against the floor. The little girl didn't react. She just stood there, her eyes locked onto Emily's, her expression unchanging. For a moment, the room was still, save for the soft creaking of the door. Emily's breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear. And then, "Emily!" It was Mike's voice. "Emily, open the door." Her heart skipped. She rushed to the front door, throwing it open. Mike stood there, breathing heavily, his face pale with fear. Jake was behind him, his eyes wide with terror. "Thank God you're okay," Mike said quickly, stepping inside. We've been trying to reach you, but there's something wrong." "What do you mean?" Emily's voice was shaky as she glanced over her shoulder. Jake looked over her shoulder, his face going white. What's that?" "Behind you." Emily turned. The little girl was gone. The room felt colder, darker, the silence heavy and oppressive. Emily stood frozen in place, the realization settling over her like a cold blanket. "I saw her," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "She was right there. She was here." Mike exchanged a glance with Jake, their expressions grim. "We saw her too," Mike said quietly, "out in the hallway, standing at the door, just like the forest. She's been following us." Emily's blood ran cold. "No, she can't. She can't still be here. We left the forest. We're out." But the air in the room was thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. As she looked back toward the open door, the distant sound of whispering, faint but unmistakable, grew louder. Jake moved toward her, his expression hardening. We should have known it wasn't over. Whatever happened out there, it's not finished. Emily glanced at him, then back at the door. There was no question now. The forest was still with them. They hadn't left it behind. The little girl was a part of it, and so was the darkness that followed. "We need to end this," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. "For good. Now." The room felt like it was closing in on them, the shadows darkening as the whispers grew louder, now almost tangible, vibrating in the walls. Emily felt the weight of the moment settle heavily in her chest. She could no longer deny it. The forest, the tree, the little girl, none of it was over. Mike looked back toward the door, his expression tense. "We need to find out what it really wants, how we can stop it. There's got to be something." Jake nodded, but his eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Maybe it's not the forest itself. Maybe the curse or whatever this is, it's tied to us now. We didn't just stumble upon it. Found us." Emily clenched her fists. "No, we can't let it follow us. We have to make sure it ends." "How do we even do that?" Sarah's voice wavered from the doorway, her face pale and filled with terror. She had returned to the apartment late after leaving to get some food, only to walk into this nightmare. "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but we can't just hide from it anymore. We have to go back." Jake looked at her sharply. "Are you insane? After everything we went through, you want to go back? Back to the forest?" Mike echoed, his voice a mix of disbelief and fear. "Do you really think that's going to help?" Emily stood firm, her mind already racing with possibilities. "It's the only way we can put an end to this. We have to confront it. We have to find out what we missed, what we didn't do right, and risk more of us disappearing." Jake snapped. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Outside, the faint whispers seemed to intensify, like the forest itself was calling to them, beckoning them back. Sarah looked around at their faces, her expression fearful but also resolute. "We don't have much time. Whatever's happening, it's getting worse. We can feel it." "I say we go," Emily said, her voice low and unwavering. "We go to the forest, figure out what's really going on, and stop it once and for all." Mike and Jake exchanged hesitant glances. Neither seemed convinced, but neither seemed ready to argue anymore. They had all been through too much. The forest had found them once, and it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything it wanted. "We're not going alone," Jake finally said, his voice grim. "We need backup. We need to know more about the forest. Anything we can learn that can help us." "I'll go with you," Sarah said firmly, stepping closer to Emily. "I'm not letting you do this alone." Emily's chest tightened with relief. At least she wouldn't be facing this nightmare completely alone. She looked at the others, seeing the hesitation in their eyes. "We have to stick together. The moment we separate, it'll come after us one by one." They all agreed reluctantly to go. The decision wasn't made lightly, but it was made with a quiet determination, an understanding that this was the only choice they had left. Whatever was haunting them, it was bigger than any of them alone. Hours later, they were back at the forest's edge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the path. The air was colder now, and the familiar feeling of dread weighed heavily on their chests. "This place," Sarah muttered, gazing at the towering trees, "feels different, like it's watching us." Mike clutched his flashlight tightly, his fingers trembling slightly. "We've already been here once. We know what to expect." Emily turned to face the others, her eyes determined. We didn't get the whole picture the first time. Whatever we didn't see, whatever we missed, it's time to finish it. Jake gritted his teeth but said nothing, stepping into the woods. The others followed silently, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence became. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects were gone. Only the whispers remained. They reached the clearing where the cursed tree had once stood, but it was gone. In its place was nothing but charred earth, the remnants of what had been. "Is this it?" Mike asked, his voice uncertain. "This is where it started," Emily said softly, "and this is where it ends." She knelt on the ground, her fingers tracing the blackened soil. As her hand made contact, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing. The whispers, which had been faint before, surged, louder now, like voices in a crowd, and it felt as though the forest was breathing. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "What did you do?" The ground beneath them trembled, and then the forest began to change. The trees twisted and groaned, their limbs stretching as if waking from a long slumber. The air grew heavy again, thick with the feeling of something ancient and malevolent stirring beneath the surface. Emily's breath quickened as the whispers became frantic, growing louder, suffocating the space. The earth beneath her began to crack open, a dark void emerging from the center of the clearing. The little girl's voice echoed through the air, soft but unmistakable. "Come back. Come back to me." The ground split wider, and from it, something began to emerge. A shadowy figure, faintly humanoid, its glowing eyes locked onto Emily. It moved slowly at first, but then quicker, its form more solid, more real with each passing second. "No," Emily gasped, standing up and backing away. "This is not how it ends." The shadowy figure rose fully from the ground, its form becoming more defined. The figure was no longer just an indistinct shape. It had grown into something tangible, a dark silhouette that towered over them. It was vaguely humanoid, but its features were warped, shifting like smoke in a windless room. The air crackled with a strange energy, and Emily could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, the fear threatening to paralyze her. The little girl's voice came again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the innocent, pleading tone from before. This voice was filled with something darker, something much older. "Asterisk, you should have left, asterisk." The figure's eyes, two hollow, glowing orbs, locked onto Emily's. She felt a sudden pull, as if an invisible force was dragging her toward it. The shadows around her twisted, coiling like serpents, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. Emily staggered backward, her mind racing. This thing, this force, it wasn't just part of the forest anymore. It was something else, something that had followed them, waited for the right moment to strike. "We have to fight it," she said through gritted teeth, turning to face Jake and the others. "We can't just stand here." Jake was already pulling something from his backpack, a flare gun. "I've got an idea, but we need to be quick." Before Emily could protest, Mike stepped forward, holding a large stick he had pulled from the ground. "We need to keep it distracted. Give Jake time to fire." Emily nodded quickly, trying to steady her breathing. "On three." One. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted again, as if the earth was alive, reaching up to grab them. Emily felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her ankle. She kicked out, but the hand was replaced by others, hundreds of them, reaching from the cracks in the earth. The shadows surrounding them stretched and pulled, trying to encircle them. The whispers turned into a chorus of disembodied voices, screeching in agony and rage. "Asterisk, you cannot escape." Asterisk, the figure roared, its voice booming across the clearing. We are escaping, Jake yelled, his hand shaking as he aimed the flare gun. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Time slowed as Jake pulled the trigger, sending a streak of brilliant red light shooting through the air. The flare hit the ground, and for a moment, everything went dark. Then, the flare exploded in a burst of blinding light. The ground trembled violently as the light expanded, washing over the figure, the trees, the very air itself. The shadows screamed, recoiling as the fire from the flare bathed the clearing in an intense, burning glow. The figure writhed, its form distorting in the light, its hollow eyes burning with fury. Emily shielded her eyes from the brightness, feeling the force of the flare push against her body, forcing her to her knees. The whispers intensified, but they were no longer the voices of the forest. They were chaotic, frantic, as if the entire world was being ripped apart. The shadowed figure howled in pain, its body flickering like a dying flame. It reached out toward Emily, but the light of the flare seemed to push it back, burning it, breaking it down into pieces. With one final, deafening scream, the figure shattered into 1,000 shards of darkness, scattering into the wind. The ground rumbled one last time, and then silence. The light from the flare faded, and the forest stood still again. The trees, once twisted and malformed, had returned to their natural state. The air, heavy and oppressive moments ago, now felt lighter. For the first time since they entered the forest, it was peaceful. Emily slowly rose to her feet, her legs shaking from the tension. She looked around at the others, their faces pale but relieved. They had done it. They had finally stopped it. But as they began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, Emily's eyes wandered back to the spot where the shadow had vanished. She saw something, a faint, flickering image in the distance. It was a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. A little girl. Her pale face was obscured by her long hair, but Emily could see the gleam of her eyes, those same glowing, empty eyes. And then, in a voice that was soft and cold, the little girl spoke. Asterisk, it's not over yet, asterisk. Before Emily could react, the ground beneath them cracked again, the whispers returning, louder than ever. The forest was still alive, and it wasn't done with them yet. The whispers surged again, louder than before, rising into a terrifying crescendo that shook the air around them. Emily's heart raced as the ground beneath their feet trembled violently, the very earth groaning with an unnatural force. The little girl's image flickered and warped, her figure twisting in the fading light. We have to leave now, Emily shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. Without thinking, she grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the edge of the clearing. Mike and Jake followed closely, their faces etched with horror and determination. The oppressive air that had once filled the forest now felt suffocating, like they were being pulled back into the darkness from which they had just escaped. The little girl's form seemed to vanish into the trees, but her voice echoed all around them, floating on the wind. You cannot run from me. You cannot escape. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. They had faced the forest, they had faced the shadowy figure, and yet it wasn't over. This wasn't just some isolated curse. There was something deeper, something that lived within the very fabric of the forest itself. But before she could make sense of it, Jake stopped in his tracks, staring into the darkness. Look, he pointed toward the distance. A faint glow was visible through the trees, an unnatural, ominous glow. It was the same eerie light they had seen in the clearing earlier. The forest around it seemed to writhe, bending unnaturally in its presence. It's the heart of the forest, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the source. Emily turned to them, feeling the weight of their shared decision. We have no choice. If we don't destroy it now, it will never end. We have to destroy the heart. Without another word, they ran toward the glow, the trees closing in around them like sentinels. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around them in a maddening chorus. The path was narrow, overgrown, and seemed to shift with every step they took, but they pressed on, determined to reach the source. After what felt like an eternity of running, they emerged into a small clearing. In the center was a massive tree, unlike anything they had seen before. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, pulsating with an unnatural light, and its roots seemed to stretch far beyond the clearing, burrowing deep into the earth. The air was thick with an almost tangible energy. The heart of the forest, Emily breathed, her voice filled with awe and fear. "This is it," Jake said, holding up a flare. "We have to burn it." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath. "We have to be quick." They gathered around the tree, the darkness around them pressing in like a wall. As Jake prepared the flare, Emily stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the energy of the tree, its pulse matching her own. The little girl's voice came again, this time filled with pure malice. "You cannot destroy me. I am the forest. I am the soul that lives here." "Not anymore," Emily whispered, reaching into her pack for the last of the flares. As she held it in her hands, she felt a surge of determination. She had faced the horrors of this place. They had all seen it, lived through it, and now it was time to end it. "On three," she said, her voice strong. "1, 2, 3. Jake fired the flare into the heart of the tree, and as it struck, the forest erupted in a violent explosion of light and sound. The ground shook, the tree groaned, and the whispers reached a deafening pitch, as if the entire forest was screaming in agony. Emily shut her eyes, covering her ears, but she could still feel the intense heat, the force of the flare burning through the air. The tree writhed as the fire consumed it, and for a moment Emily thought she saw something. A face, hidden in the bark, grinning at her. But she refused to look away. They had to finish it. And then, with one final, soul-piercing scream, the tree exploded into a burst of light. The ground cracked open, and the forest seemed to collapse inward, folding in on itself as the fire spread through the roots, consuming everything in its path. For a long moment, everything was still. The whispers had stopped. The oppressive presence that had once suffocated the forest was gone. Emily opened her eyes slowly, her body shaking from the intensity of the moment. The clearing was empty now. The heart of the forest was no more. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Emily turned to the others, their faces still pale, their bodies weary. They had survived. They had finally ended the nightmare. But deep down, Emily knew something had changed. The forest, the darkness. It was gone, but the feeling of it remained, like an echo in her mind. And as they made their way back to the road, the world seemed strangely quiet, almost too quiet. But then, just as they reached the edge of the woods, a single, haunting whisper broke the silence. Asterisk, "It's never truly over, asterisk." Emily's blood ran cold, but she didn't turn back. She couldn't. They had survived. For now, that was enough. The end.